Test. Is it working? Good morning.
Hello.
Good morning. One more time. Good morning. How is everyone doing this morning? Good.
Obviously, the coffee isn't working, right?
Well, it is an early morning, and it's Saturday.
True.
Okay. Well, my name is Tiana Mushashik. Before we begin, I want to take this time to humbly acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land in which Eastern Oregon University is upon. The Cayuse, Umatilla, Walla Walla, Nez Perce, Shoshone Bannock, and the Burns Paiute people. We celebrate their traditions, languages, and stories. We acknowledge their continuing connection to this land, water, and community, and pay our respects to these original custodians of Northeastern Oregon. We also want to recognize that February is Black History Month. Black History Month is a significant time in our history as we remember the important contributions and achievements of African Americans throughout our nation's history. As I mentioned, my name is Tiana, and I am the coordinator of the Student Council for Multicultural Affairs, also known as the SCMA. The SCMA is a student fee-funded unit under the Multicultural Center that is made up of a group of EOU student leaders who serve as advocates for diversity and multicultural education and awareness. In the work we do, we celebrate and validate the rich diversity that our students bring and provide opportunities for their voices to be heard. We are committed to sharing our students' cultures, identities, and experiences within EOU, advocating for their needs and furthering diversity and inclusion. The CEAD Conference is the Student Council's primary program that fulfills our goals to offer diversity education and awareness. We are thrilled to provide for you all this opportunity to learn more about diversity and the value each of us play helping to move this work forward for the betterment of our campus. I want to take this time to thank and recognize our sponsors who helped make this conference possible. The Student Council for Multicultural Affairs, the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Assessment, ASEOU Student Fee Committee, the EOU Multicultural Center, student council members and fellow students who volunteered to help promote the CEAD Conference. We also want to thank the campus caucus facilitators, workshop presenters, and speakers for coming to share new knowledge and information to all of us. Most of all, I want to take this time to thank you all for attending this year's 7th annual CEAD Conference. It's great that you all want to be here and take part in this conference and expand your knowledge of diversity. Also, I do want to extend a warm welcome to everyone from President Insco. He planned to be here but has fallen ill, and so he sends his regards. Next, I want to ask Nicole Almanza, my co-MC, to go over the schedule.
Morning, everyone. It's my last time on the mic. I'm happy. Okay, so my name's Nicole Monsa, like Deanna said, and I'm the Director for Diversity and Equity for ASEOU. I'm also the student representative on the UOU Board of Trustees. If you have any issues, come to me, okay? No. My role is to represent and advocate for diverse students as well as plan educational opportunities for the school to partake in, like you're all doing. Yay. Thank you. I act as a bridge between the diverse students and student government. We work together on topics relating to diversity and equity that may affect the students on campus. And from here, we bring programs to life that enhance our community's understanding of differences in order to create a more welcoming and inclusive campus. Last year, I challenged you all to step out of your comfort zones and let yourselves be challenged. This year, I ask you to take it one step further and embrace the discomforts you may feel by practicing vulnerability, authenticity, and empathy. All of us have different lives and different experiences. Share and listen to each other. By embracing these acts of vulnerability, we will allow ourselves to understand each other, and we will be one step closer to creating a diverse and inclusive campus. Now, I'm going to go over today's schedule and add a couple of changes that we made. We will begin this morning with our keynote speaker, Dr. Amy Irby Shasame. And then there will be 2 workshop sessions and a lunch session where we will all participate in. Session 1 starts immediately after our keynote. There are 3 workshops you can choose to attend. All workshop classrooms are on the west side of the building. After session 1 at 11:35, we will have our buffet lunch served. During lunch, we will have racial identity caucus spaces. A caucus is a space for facilitated discussion around a shared experience, background, or identity. CEAD caucus spaces are designed to address interests and issues of specific racial identity groups and provide an opportunity to discuss the subjects and forms of oppression that affect each racial identity. The goals of the caucus are to provide a space to share ideas and experiences, create a community, develop a sense of belonging, and build capacity for solidarity. We invite you to join one of the identity caucuses during lunch. There is an insert in your program that was distributed earlier that has more information about the spaces and the rooms where each caucus will be held at. Please pick up your lunch at the lobby and then take it to the classroom for discussion. At 12:45, session 2 will start. We'll have the same workshop repeated from session 1 to allow you to participate in ones you missed during the morning session. After second session, we will meet here for a 30-minute closing panel. We have a number of great workshops for you all today. If you get to a workshop and it's full, please choose your second option. And now for a couple of changes. Let me find the paper. So 3 changes I want to mark. The White Caucus spaces will be held in rooms 144, 146, and 148. This to ensure that the size is adequate for a good discussion. For anyone who cannot download the guidebook app, we have just sent out a PDF version of the program for your convenience. And lastly, the room numbers may be a little, these are the room numbers that are correct in the guidebook, but not on your paper copy of the program. So Dr. Amy Irby Shasame will be in room 146. Presenter Mahajan will be in 144. And presenter George will be in 142. Did y'all note that? Okay. Now back to Tiana.
Now to go over the community agreements that you all have. Our hope is that it will help establish a framework that will ensure openness, maximize participation, and respectful dialogue. Please use these as guiding principles as you go through the day. Some things I want to challenge you all with are be fully present. Being fully present means being willing to not check your phone and to give the speaker our full attention in order to maximize this opportunity to learn and gain new knowledge and information. Pay attention to your reaction. Watch your own emotions and pay attention to how it may influence your interest in hearing new information. When something triggers us in a way that makes us upset or annoyed, we often miss critical parts of what is being said. If what is being said creates an emotional response in you, be extra aware and challenge yourself to listen and be open-minded to hearing the full intent and meaning of what is being shared. Also, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to engage in dialogue, network, and connect with people that you don't know already. And I challenge you all to make new friends, and most of all, have fun. Today, I have the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker for this year's 2018 CEAD Conference, Dr. Amy Irby Shasame. Dr. Irby Shasame is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of West Georgia, where she teaches courses on medical sociology, health disparities, the sociology of mental health and illness, and social problems. She earned her BA from DePaul University and her master's and PhD in sociology from Indiana University. She has published articles in multiple journals, Ethnicity and Health, Research on Aging, Teaching Sociology, and the Journal for the Liberal Arts and Sciences. Dr. Irby Shasame explores the ways in which racism and discrimination get under your skin and impact one's physical and mental health. So let's all give a warm welcome to Dr. Amy Irby Shasame.
want to time myself, so I'm just setting my timer. All right. So first of all, I want to say thank you. Um, I was surprised at the pronunciation of my name because my colleagues at my own university almost never pronounce it right, and you all did a great job. So kudos to you for that. Good morning, and thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to be here and to talk to you about things that I teach about and that I research on at my own university. I also want to thank you for the opportunity to come to Oregon. So this is my first time in the state. And coming to Oregon also allowed me to utilize some articles of clothing that I have not used in a very long time. So about a year ago, I moved from Indiana to Georgia, and I have not had to pull out my coat or my gloves or my scarf. So I kind of blew the dust off of them and got to wear them this week. So thank you. On a more serious note, as previously mentioned, I'm Amy Irby-Shasamy, and I am a sociology professor at the University of West Georgia. And I'm a medical sociologist. I teach about health disparities and differences in health, particularly as they relate to race and ethnicity. And so, because I teach about health, I'm going to start off with a question. And the question that I want you all to think about, and perhaps you can jot it down. I see that people have a little note section in their booklet. And so I want you to take maybe about 30 seconds to jot down 3 or 4 things that can negatively impact your health. So jot down about 3 or 4 things that can negatively impact your health. All right. So, by a show of hands, how many people wrote down eating unhealthy? All right. Great. How many people wrote down not exercising or a sedentary lifestyle? Excellent. Um, did anybody write down not getting enough sleep? Good. All right. Let's see. Did anybody mention heavy drinking? No problem. I won't judge. All right. So these are the top things that people think about when you ask them what sorts of things negatively influence your health. So they say not or eating unhealthy, not exercising, smoking, and heavy drinking. As a medical sociologist, so I'm a sociologist, specifically a medical sociologist, as a medical sociologist, these aren't the things that I directly examine when I seek to understand how our health is impacted, right? So as a medical sociologist, I look at how our social environment and our social context influence our health. So how do the places in which we live, how do the places in which we work, the places that we play and learn, how do they influence our health? How did your neighborhoods influence your health? How does being at the university and the experiences that you have, how does that influence your health? These are the sorts of things that I study, and this is what I'll talk about during my talk today. All right. So the other thing that I research is I seek to understand how discrimination and unfair treatment get under the skin and affect one's health. And in order for us to talk about that, first I want to make sure we have 2 definitions down. And so I'm going to give you 2 definitions of racism or discrimination. I'll use those 2 terms interchangeably. And then we'll talk about how this connects to health. And this is probably the most important part of my talk, is that these 2 definitions. The way that I'm going to give you these definitions, I love to tell stories, so I'm going to tell you a story. This story actually comes from Kamara Jones, who is a public health agent And so in her article, The Gardener's Tale, this is the way she lays it out. I'll add a little bit to it, but I'll kind of keep the essence of what she has in her article. So I want you to imagine that there's a garden. And in the garden, there are 2 flower pots. One flower pot has rich, fertile soil, and the other flower pot has poor, rocky soil. I also want you to imagine that there are 2 packets of seeds, one for yellow flowers and one for pink flowers. So what happens is the yellow flowers go in the rich, fertile soil. The pink flowers go in the poor, rocky soil. So I want us to think about the rain falling and the sun shining, and how would the growth rate be different for the 2 flowers? So what you probably imagine is that the flowers that are here in the rich, fertile soil will grow fast, they'll grow tall, and they'll grow strong. If we're to compare that to the pink flowers, which are in the poor, rocky soil, we can imagine that they probably will survive, but it might be a little bit more difficult, right? They won't grow as tall or as strong. Most of them will only get to middling height, and those that are weak may not even survive. I also want you to imagine that the flowers begin to grow, and this is what we'll see, right? So they grow, and we see buds from the yellow flowers, and we see that the pink flowers are growing, but not as well. What about as the years go on? Will we see a change just because time has changed? Most likely we won't. And so when the seeds begin to drop and to produce new flowers, the offspring have the same growth rate. We see that the yellow flowers are successful and the pink flowers are struggling to survive. And we could watch this year after year after year and begin to see the same thing. I also want you to think about children that come along and they look at these 2 flower pots, and which one of the flowers do you think that the children will prefer? Which one would you want to pick and give to someone, right? So, of course, you would want to give the yellow flowers. And perhaps the children say that I'm the gardener, and the children say, wow, yellow flowers are great. What is so great about yellow flowers? And I, as a gardener, say, yellow flowers are stronger. The last thing that I want you to imagine is that the wind blows and one of the petals from the pink flowers flies over into the yellow flower pot. And I, as a gardener, pick up that flower and I say, I don't want this pink flower with those yellow flowers because they may negatively impact the success and growth rate of the yellow flowers. So how does this pertain to racism and discrimination? And I'm going to explain this for you. So the first definition is internalized racism. And so internalized racism, and I'm going to give you 2 definitions. So internalized racism is differential access to goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. And I'm just going to repeat that one more time. So it's differences in access to goods, services, and opportunities by race. Institutionalized racism is sometimes legalized, and it often manifests as inherited disadvantage. So that means that a person has it and it's sort of inherited. It's often coded in our institutions of customs and our practices, and it's oftentimes hard to point out a perpetrator of institutionalized discrimination. And it's often inaction in the face of need. Examples of institutionalized discrimination include, as I have up here, differential access to quality education, differential access to good neighborhoods, to gainful employment, and to appropriate medical facilities. So where do we see an example of institutionalized discrimination in the Gardener's Tale? Well, we see it in the initial historical insult of separating the 2 flowers, right? So we put these 2 flowers in different conditions in which they are asked to grow and thrive. And so we can think about how this translates to racial groups, right? So if we think about the history of the U.S., we can think about how racial groups initially were put into two separate places because of legalized segregation and so forth, and they were asked to learn, grow, and to thrive. And these things continue today. And I'll speak a little bit about things like residential segregation in this talk, but we'll talk about it more in the workshop. So for now, if people are skeptical about whether residential segregation still exists, just bear with me for the talk. We'll talk about it more in the workshop. And so again, the flowers are asked to grow and thrive in very different conditions in much the same way that racial groups are given different opportunities to be successful. I want to show you a contemporary example and sort of give you a concrete example to sort of this abstract definition. So what's going to happen is we're going to have to see like a 3-second ad, but then the video will come up. It's also a little fuzzy, but it's good enough for you to be able to see these differences. When you're watching this video, what I want you to be mindful of is where you see differences.
It's final exams week, and that means two things. The library is packed, and I'll be writing papers.
So when you're watching the video, I want you to look for differences and opportunities. This is about a 4-minute clip, and so I want you to pay attention. Where might you see examples of institutionalized discrimination?
It's a short drive from Harpo Studios to Harper High School. Harper is home to almost 1,500 students in this low-income inner-city neighborhood. Only 40% of the students here end up with a diploma.
If you want something at Harper, I mean, you really got to fight for it. It's hard. It's hard.
35 miles due west of Harper High is Neuqua Valley High School, set in the affluent suburb of Naperville. It is a $62 million state-of-the-art facility. The graduation rate here is 99%.
I think all of us, it was just a given that we would graduate from high school.
On a cold Tuesday morning, a busload of students from the school in Naperville arrive at Harper High School. The metal detectors are the first big surprise.
I was scared. I mean, I'm not gonna lie.
It became very intimidating and very like, do I feel safe?
Coin?
Yeah.
The kids from the inner city aren't expecting what they find when they get off the bus either.
This school is way better than I thought it would be.
The best school in Chicago can't even compare to this.
The differences between the two schools are immediately apparent. This is the Olympic-sized pool at the school in suburbia.
This is our pool over here. Yeah.
This is real nice.
There's a pool at Harper, too, but it hasn't been filled with water in 10 years.
Oh my goodness.
Oh man. Oh, it leaks.
In the suburbs, there's a state-of-the-art gym and fitness center.
Oh my goodness. Y'all got treadmills and bikes and...
Do you guys have a cardio room or
No.
Back in Chicago, the visiting kids find a run-down gym with a leaking ceiling.
Falling apart. What if it's like water? I don't know.
And a beat-up weight room.
Oh my goodness.
That would be so uncomfortable.
They have worn through it.
A lot of it's like really, really old.
As they sit in on classes, they quickly discover this curriculum is far more rigorous than at Harper High.
Okay, so this is just our normal bandit graph.
Tiffany, who hopes to major in business management and earned an A in trigonometry at Harper High, comes out of the class clearly worried.
I was looking at their math problems that they're doing, and I'm looking like, what language is that? As soon as I get to college, I'm going to be lost.
That might help explain these alarming test scores. At Harper High School, just 16% of the students tested are meeting state standards in reading, 1.5% in science, and in math, 0.5%. Compare those figures to the scores at the suburban school. 78% meet state standards in reading, 76% in science, and 77% in math.
If we had the same opportunities that they have here, a lot of our test scores would just go up.
There are more than 24 advanced placement classes ordered to the students in the suburban school.
They got it made here. I mean, it's just like, it's endless opportunities. And I just wish we had those at Harper.
At Harper High, there are a total of 2 advanced placement classes. Over and over, they see the glaring inequities between the 2 schools. It is a harsh lesson that leaves many of the kids asking, why?
I feel like I've been cheated. I've been gypped.
They have way more than we have at our school. It's sad. It really is. It's sad.
It's so mind-blowing to think about that there's such a difference and we're both in the same state within an hour away from each other.
We really take the resources for granted. And that's one reason that this is such an eye-opener.
I'm glad that y'all have it, because if we don't have it, I'm glad somebody have it. But it's the simple fact that we see y'all doing well. We want to do well, too.
As a parent, one
All right. So where do we see examples of difference in opportunities in the video that we just watched? And so you probably maybe have noted down a couple things. We can think about the number of advanced placement classes there were, right? We can think about the quality of the school and the education. And so we can think about also what shapes what school you go to. What shapes what school you go to is the neighborhood that you live in generally, right? And neighborhoods have intentionally sort of been segregated in interesting ways, right? And again, like I said, we'll talk about that a little bit in the workshop. And so this video is a little bit dated, but these things continue to exist. And so just as a very quick example, a couple years ago, I was doing a research project where we interviewed black and white women for this study. And there was a woman who was a teacher in one of the inner city schools in Indianapolis. And she was talking about her experience. And she said, I was in a classroom in which there were 36 students and there were 25 desks. And so what we would have to do is rotate who would get to sit in a chair. And so this was just 2 years ago when I talked to this woman. She also said we had a classroom that didn't have a window. And so they finally decided we'll put a little hole and make a little window. And she said, I guess they forgot about us because one day there was a squirrel in the classroom. And I was like, hey, you know. And so we could think about how these may be similar to or different than the experience that we had, but how these are differences in opportunities. All right, so I told you I would give you 2 definitions of racism and discrimination, right? And so I want to go to our next one. So our next type of racism or discrimination is personally mediated racism, and you may have heard it called a different term. This is the kind of racism and discrimination that people think about when they think about discrimination and racism. So this is prejudice, right? Which means that we have differential assumptions about a person's abilities and their motives and their intentions because of their race. This is also differences in actions towards others because of their race. And again, this is what most people think of when they think about discrimination. These include examples of lack of respect, so having poor service or no service. This is when people are suspicious of you, so they may clutch your purse because they're scared of you, or when people devalue you. So when they're surprised at your competence or at your ability to articulate. So where do we see an example of personally mediated discrimination in the gardener's tale? Remember when the wind blew and the pink flower flew over into the yellow flowers, and I, as the gardener, picked it up and I took it out? So this was an example of personally mediated discrimination in which I, as the gardener, believed that the yellow flowers, or the pink flowers, would negatively impact the success of the yellow flowers, and so I didn't even allow it a chance to be successful, right? We can think about in the story when the children, they began to prefer the yellow flowers. And notice that I, as the gardener, when they talked about why do you prefer the yellow flowers, and I said that they were stronger, I did not note the differences in the conditions under which the flowers were made to grow. Much like today, parents may indirectly or directly teach their children that one racial group is better in some sort of way, more moral, more intelligent, more ambitious, and more motivational. And so we really have to think about how history matters, right? And also how conditions under which people are made to grow and thrive are different. As a contemporary example, I want you to think more specifically about race-based stressors, which some of you may have experienced. So I want you, and I think that this fits well with personally mediated racism because we're talking about the assumptions that people have about us. So imagine that people dress up as you, as your racial group for Halloween, and consider your racial group to be a sports mascot. That's a race-based stressor. Imagine being a kid in school and you are from Africa and people are scared to be your friend because they assume simply because you are African, you must have AIDS. Imagine because you are Asian, people automatically assume that you are Chinese, even though there are 48 different Asian countries. Imagine you are Latino and you are often suspected of being an undocumented immigrant simply because of your race. Imagine you are from the Middle East and you wear a hijab and people assume that you are a terrorist and they say racist slurs to you simply because of your ethnicity. Imagine that you are a black woman with a black baby boy and people comment on how beautiful and adorable this baby is, but in your head you wonder, when will this boy no longer be considered adorable, but they will be considered criminal? Imagine being biracial or a Pacific Islander, and people often ask you, what are you? Imagine being white and being in a relationship with someone of a different race than you and being worried that you will be discriminated against because of the race of your significant other. So these are all examples of race-based stressors. And so in just a moment, we're going to talk about how these experiences can get under the skin and affect our health. So we talked about two types of discrimination: institutional discrimination, which is focused on differences and opportunities. And then we've talked about personally mediated discrimination, which is focused on the different assumptions that people have toward us and the different actions that they enact. And so just in terms of solutions, I want us to talk a little bit about if we want to help people to reach their full potential, what do we do? And so we can think about those two different types of racism, right? So on the one hand, we could seek to address personally mediated discrimination. So when the wind begins to blow, when the flowers from the pink move over to the yellow, we could say we're going to leave them there. And that would help those flowers that blow over into the yellow flowers, right? But it does little to help the entire racial group. We could also think about institutionalized discrimination, right? And so if we really want to make a large-scale change, we need to think about changing the conditions, right? So with the flowers, what we would do is put them in the same environment, right, with the rich, fertile soil at best, and at least we would at least give the other flowers the same opportunities in which to grow and thrive. Much like we need to think about how to integrate and diversify our schools and our neighborhoods so that we all have the same opportunities. And to do this on the front end instead of the back end. So things like scholarships are great, right? But if we think about that video where we see that from the beginning, these students are disadvantaged, right? And so we want to make sure that we're integrating places very early in life. So now I'd like to go to the next part of my talk. And I want to demonstrate how discrimination in places that lack diversity affect our health. And so we've talked a little bit about residentially segregated neighborhoods. And so how does institutionalized racism or discrimination affect our health? I want to tell you about a research project that I did a few years ago. And so in this research project, there were 28 black men that we recruited to be in this study. We gave them cell phones, and what they did is twice a week, they would get surveys through the cell phone, and they would answer these questions. These black men, they were between the ages of 16 and 19, and they came from what we call concentrated disadvantage, neighborhoods that were concentrated disadvantage. And so what this simply means is that they had high rates of poverty, high rates of unemployment, high rates of single-parent families, high rates of public use, and they were residentially segregated. And so what I was interested in is understanding how being in a segregated environment can affect your health. And so I thought about what sorts of stressors might it be like to live in urban places that may be stressful and sort of have all these things going on. And so twice a week, I would ask the men this question through the survey. So focus on this side. I thought this was going to come next. Let's focus on this side first. And so some questions that I asked was, do you take a longer or a different route to a place you're going because you want to avoid trouble or you want to be safe? Are you nervous about gunshots or sirens at night? Do you deal with loud and noisy neighbors? Are you worried about the safety of your family and your friends? Are you stopped and questioned by the police in your neighborhood? Are you watched closely in the department store in your neighborhood by the salespeople? Do you fear confrontation? And do you have to work to help to pay the bills in your family? And so what research shows is that chronic stress like this can be related to poor sleep, right? And so because when people are dealing with a lot of stressors, they may be lying awake, thinking about what has happened, or anticipate what is going to happen to them. And so I was really interested in how these stressors impact a person's sleep. And sleep is really important because when you sleep, that's when your body begins to repair itself, right? So this is why the doctor tells you when you're sick that you need to rest, because this is when the body is repairing itself. And so I asked them questions about sleep. Do they have trouble falling asleep, trouble waking up, going back to sleep at night, and so forth. And then I also asked them what we call somatic symptoms. And so this sort of means physical symptoms. Do they have symptoms such as headaches, nausea, and so forth? And so I'm still in the process of looking at the relationship between these things and sleep and somatic symptoms. But we can begin to think about how hearing gunshots at night and hearing sirens and being stopped by the police, how that could negatively impact our health. What I'm going to show you is what research has already shown about how segregation influences health in a negative way. And I want you to bear in mind that definition of institutional discrimination. So remember, institutional discrimination is about differences in opportunities. And so neighborhoods can create differences in opportunities to be healthy. And so one thing that research finds is that segregated areas affect neighborhoods themselves, right? So segregated neighborhoods tend to have lower air and water quality. They also are more likely to be beside hazardous waste sites, which we can imagine would be bad for your health. Segregated neighborhoods also are, are associated with, if we think about the homes in these neighborhoods, they tend to be substandard. So they have drafts, poor ventilation, and leaks. And all these things are related to asthma, right? And so asthma is the #1 chronic illness for children. In addition to that, poor segregated neighborhoods are more likely to have noise issues, which affect sleep and affect fetal development, actually. The homes in poor segregated neighborhoods are also more likely to have mold and dust, right? Again, associated with respiratory issues. And they also have are more likely to have lead in the homes. And lead is really bad for health, right? So lead affects development as well as can contribute to learning disabilities. Segregated neighborhoods can also affect what it is that we want to do. So remember in the beginning I asked you sort of what things lead to better or poor health, and you talked about exercising and eating healthy. Well, when you're in segregated neighborhoods, it can constrain the choices that you make, right? So if you're in a neighborhood that's not safe or doesn't have sidewalks or walking trails or parks or swimming pools, then it can discourage you from physical activity. People in segregated neighborhoods have less access to healthy food. So there are more fast food outlets and liquor stores, and tobacco and alcohol industries actually target low-income neighborhoods. And this is related to things like diabetes and heart disease and obesity. And then segregated neighborhoods can affect medical care, right? And so actually hospitals in segregated neighborhoods are more likely to close than those in affluent neighborhoods. And so I want us to think back again to that definition of institutional discrimination and see how being in a segregated neighborhood is associated with different opportunities to be healthy. And I don't want to combine this only to urban environments, right? We can think about how this translates to rural settings, right? Some of these things that I mentioned in terms of access to healthy foods are also problems in rural environments as well. And so we can think about how it translates, but also how there are unique stressors in rural places. So I'm looking at my time, all right? And so what I want to do next is I want to talk about how personally mediated racism gets under the skin and affects health. And the way that I do that is I'm interested in interracial spaces, right? So I'm interested in interracial families, interracial marriages, interracial churches, and so forth. And so what I did a research a couple years back was on interracial relationships. So how does being in an interracial relationship affect health, or does it affect health? And so as a little bit of background, in 1970, less than 1% of the population was intermarried, and that number increased to 1% in 1980. So now if we look at the far end of the graph, in 2010, there are about 10% of marriages are interracial. What may or may not surprise people is who's more likely to be intermarried. And so whites are actually least likely to be intermarried, followed by blacks, even though blacks show the most support for interracial marriages, followed by Asians, and American Indians are more likely to be in interracial relationships. So on the one hand, we might say, well, I don't really see how interracial relationships could negatively affect health, right? If we think about the way society is, we're more accepting of racial groups. We're more accepting of integration in schools, right, and in public spaces. But the other thing is that people are less accepting of integration in more intimate spaces, right? And so in things like marriages and things like neighborhoods. And so, And so we can think about how this may matter. So for example, if you go to the U.S. Department of Justice's website, you'll see examples of, even today, of cross burnings, right? Fire bombings that people in interracial relationships face. And you can also think about how people may be accepting of interracial marriages, but how it might change if you think about specifically your family, right? The other thing that's interesting is if you ask people about how they feel about interracial marriages, it differs based on the racial partner. So for example, people are more accepting if the racial partner is white, followed by Asian, Hispanic, and last if that partner is black. So to cut to the chase of what I found in the research, I was interested in, I looked at a national survey, two different surveys. I'm going to talk about the research with blacks and whites, but I did another survey that had blacks, whites, Hispanics, and Asians in it. And there were questions related to discrimination, right? So we asked them questions about discrimination. We also asked them questions about health, specifically about anxiety, depressive symptoms, and substance use. And the reason why we asked about substance use is because men tend to externalize their emotions, right? And women tend to internalize. And so what I asked was, do people in interracial relationships, first, do they experience more discrimination? So we compare whites in same-race relationships with whites in interracial relationships, and whites and blacks in same-race relationships with blacks in interracial relationships. And I hypothesized that people in interracial relationships will experience more discrimination and different types of discrimination. I also say that this discrimination will be what will explain the poor health that they have, right? So it's not that being in an interracial relationship is bad for health, but that the discrimination may help to explain that. And I also say that the negative interactions that people have with their family members will also explain why they may have poor health. So in the research, what I find, these are sort of the measures of discrimination, which I talked about, so I'm going to skip that. What I find is that people in interracial relationships do report more discrimination, both whites and blacks who are in interracial relationships. This is probably not surprising. They also report more negative interactions with family members. The other thing that's very interesting is that they report more odds of depressive symptoms, anxiety, and substance use. And that is in large part explains why we see this association between being in an interracial relationship and mental distress. So sort of what's the connection here, right? So why is it that being in an interracial relationship could lead to anxiety symptoms or substance use? So this is my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that individuals in interracial relationships may be worried about the discrimination that they may experience, right? And so anxiety is associated with worry, right? And so that's why we see that connection there. Interracial couples may also be frustrated by the treatment that they get from the general public and from their family members, which becomes manifested in substance use. And so what research finds is that substance use is a coping mechanism for dealing with actual or perceived discrimination. And so again, I want to note, because I don't want people to leave and say, being in an interracial relationship is bad for your health. That's not the takeaway point. Okay. So the takeaway point is that discrimination is bad for our health, right? So you can leave and you can say that. Discrimination is bad for your health. And so this is how we can see how personally mediated discrimination affects our health. So first we saw how institutionalized discrimination can affect our physical health, right? Things like sleep quality and having headaches. Now we look at personally mediated discrimination, and we can see how personally mediated discrimination can be associated with mental distress. And so as I get ready to talk about the last thing, looking at that clock, I want to show how discrimination can physiologically influence us and affect us. So I want you to imagine that you're dealing with a lot of different stressors in life. So perhaps you're dealing with issues related to poverty, you're dealing with job insecurity, you're dealing with discrimination and unfair treatment. All these things are likely to increase illness, and there are biological reasons for this. So when we are threatened and when we don't feel that we're in control of our lives, there's a critical biological reaction that kicks in. And that reaction is called the stress response. You all have experienced it. So imagine if a vicious dog is chasing you, right? Your body is going to produce more adrenaline and you're going to run faster, right? Or let's say you're in a situation in which you're in a fight. The adrenaline is going to kick in and you're going to hit harder, right? So this is what happens when we're in stressful environments. When the brain perceives that there's a stressor or a threat, it signals to the adrenal glands to release potent stress hormones. Another one of those stress hormones is called cortisol, which is pictured on the slide. And cortisol will flood your bloodstream, and it will increase your heart rate, it'll increase your blood pressure, and it'll put your body on alert, making you run faster. You know, you've heard people lifting cars off of, kids and all this kind of stuff. It's because your adrenaline is rushing. And so cortisol can be really good for you, right? It can improve your memory, it can enhance your immune function, and it can help you reestablish energy supplies. Mother Nature put all this stuff in there so that we can survive. A normal stress response will spike up when it needs to, and then it will go back down. But what happens when you have a lot of stressors and they don't turn off? When you're dealing with racism, when you're dealing with gender discrimination, when you're dealing with the stressors related to being low income. What happens when the stress response doesn't turn off and it stays on for months and it stays on for years? What happens is that your body begins to work overtime and you produce too much cortisol. And what happens is that when you produce too much cortisol, it can impair your immune function. It can inhibit your memory, and it can actually cause areas of your brain to shrink. So when you get prolonged activation of the stress hormones, this can affect your heart rate, affect your ability to handle insulin and glucose, which leads to things like heart disease and diabetes and so forth. So because of stress, it can literally wear and tear on your body. So sometimes when you see a person and they tell you their age and you're kind of surprised because they look older than what you thought they were. Well, internally, that might be happening to them too. Their cells and their body is aging quicker because of the stress that they're experiencing. And so what researchers believe is that this happens when we have all these sort of stressors with discrimination included in that. So I'm going to end my talk in much the same way that I began. If I were to ask you what things lead to bad health, what would you say? So on your paper, you probably have listed things like eating unhealthy, not exercising, smoking, and heavy drinking. But after this talk, I hope that you will also think about how institutionalized racism and personally mediated racism get under your skin and affect health, how segregation and race-based stressors can affect our mental health. And so my hope is that in this talk, it makes you think about how to encourage and promote diversity in a healthy way. I hope you understand the potential negative consequences of discrimination and racism, and that when you go into your organizations, and for those who are graduating, when you go into workplaces, you try to make these places safe places for people to learn and thrive and grow. And so I'm going to end right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Irbi Shasami. Let's give her one more round of applause, please. Okay, just a little bit clarification. So for those of you that have the actual paper programs, the room numbers were 144 and 146 got switched, but the actual papers on the classrooms is correct. Yes. So if you see the ones right by the door, that's the correct numbers. So don't get confused. So enjoy the rest of the conference, and we will see you all back here for the closing panel at 2:20. Have fun. Have fun. Have fun. Have fun.